Hey, well, I have the great pleasure in introducing Kate Mathis, who is a specialist in Celtic Celtic studies, who has taught in Edinburgh and Glasgow and Aberdeen, and currently working in her on her monograph on the development of Deirdre and from early times to the Celtic revival. So I can see that your slide is all ready and waiting to go. So please carry on.
Thank you, Oisín, and thank you to everyone for joining or remaining with us. It's a pleasure to be taking part in the conference. Like many of us, I suspect I had conceived this paper as an opportunity to present archival research that in part has yet to take place, so I will also focus on a slightly different angle than anticipated initially. And what follows, I am gladly indebted to several colleagues and friends whose own research in recent years has established the particularly Scottish aspect of the period known as the Celtic Revival or Celtic Renaissance, spanning the latter and opening decades of the 19th and 20th centuries. And I'd like to mention especially the work of Michael Shaw, Murdo MacDonald, Priscilla Scott, Richard Barlow and Peter Mackay, among others, some of whom I'll come to. With some irony, the contemporary gulf between Gaelic-speaking and solely Anglophone contributors to the revival itself has tended to be maintained among its scholars and critics, an artificial and frankly unhelpful division that some of this work has begun to redress. That's a point I'll return to in the second half of this paper, considering the somewhat vexed relationship of my subject, Fiona McLeod, to the Gaelic language and the riches of its oral culture, about which we've already heard so much. For the first half, I'll focus, like Robbie and Natasha, on the theme of invisible work in the specific context of women's engagement with islands and the concept thereof. My angle for the panel was intended as the published in print, in contrast to the archival or performed. So, we begin on a somewhat more distant and clement island than our own northern jewels of Shetland, Orkney and the Hebrides in Sicily, where on December 14th, 1905, the poet, editor and literary critic William Sharp was laid to rest in the private cemetery of the Maniace estate, home to Alexander Hood, 5th Duke of Bronte. The estate is in close proximity to the slopes of Mount Etna, a changeable and complex landscape of considerable beauty that Sharp had described in several publications. He and his wife Elizabeth were frequent visitors to the island for the previous 5 years. Elizabeth Sharp, William's first cousin, co-author and eventual biographer, recorded her own impressions of Maniace in the summer of 1901, referring to its church, its former monastery, now the Ducal Castello, and the many relics of the first Duke, Admiral Horatio Nelson, which adorned its interior and grounds. Most prominent of these was and is Nelson's memorial, described by Elizabeth as a great Iona cross carved in lava erected in the courtyard. This impressive piece of sculpture, somewhat out of place among the prevailing Italianate style of its surroundings, is not contemporary to the time of Nelson's death in 1805, but was designed by the Sharps' host, the 5th Duke, in 1891, and it's similar to the cross that he would also design for William's grave itself, seen here at number 7 and in close-up. The grave's inscription, however, was William Sharp's own choice, decided long in advance. It consists of 2 couplets, each with their author's initials. The first, signed W.S., reads poignantly, "Farewell to the known and exhausted, welcome the unknown and illimitable," acknowledging the years of ill health that culminated in the poet's death, aged only 50. The second, just beneath it, is signed F.M., "Love is greater than we can conceive, and death is the keeper of unknown redemptions," a quotation from the story entitled The Distant Country, published in 1899 in a volume of tales and spiritual anecdotes, The Dominion of Dreams. F.M., that collection's advertised author, was Fiona McLeod, whose literary reputation was established in 1894 with the appearance of her first novel, Farish, a Romance of the Isles. Followed by several other novels, many set in island locations, by plays, anthologies of poems, and numerous essays on the ideals and ideologies of the Celtic Revival. Fiona's fame and reputation far outstripped William Sharp's, and her work enjoyed far greater commercial success, resulting in prolific correspondence with luminaries of the revival on both sides of the Irish Sea, including William Butler Yeats. Alongside her well-publicised status as a native of the Hebrides, to which I'll return, Fiona McLeod's most notable characteristic was her reclusive temperament and fragile health, praised by critics as informing the delicacy of her visionary prose and spiritual insight, but also regretted by adoring fans when it prevented her attendance at public events, including the premieres of her own plays. On such occasions, it was commonplace for William Sharp, in the guise of Fiona's cousin, to attend in her stead, and they also had in common many correspondents, including Yeats, to whom William would report on Fiona's progress with her latest work, and vice versa. These and similar deflections passed largely unremarked by Fiona's admirers among the general public, most of whom would never have heard of William Sharp, but at least some of their shared acquaintance became suspicious well before the revelation that William's sudden death at Maniace in 1905 necessitated. This too had been anticipated, and Elizabeth Sharp carried out her husband's instructions promptly. In the days that followed his death, she posted a number of cards that William had prepared the same year as he chose his epitaph, 1899, which carried the following message: "This will reach you after my death. You will think I have deceived you about Fiona McLeod, but in absolute privacy I tell you I have not. However, in certain details I have inevitably misled you. Only it is a mystery. Perhaps you will understand. Best is silence." And the cards, signed William Sharp, concluded, "It is only right, however, to add that I, and I only, am the author in the literal and literary sense of all written under the name of Fiona McLeod." The same revelation was released to the London press and, for her international readers, telegraphed across the Atlantic. The headline in the New York Times on December 15th, the day after William's funeral, declared in capitals, "Sharp's death solves a literary mystery." That it referred to Paisley-born William as an English author appears to confirm the extent to which the identity of his creation, Fiona, was far more vividly recalled than his own, and the column devoted several inches to speculation on the subject of William's motives for the literary deception, so purple that it would sit neatly in a modern tabloid. Their most relevant comment, that the pseudonym was at first adopted because Mr. Sharp expected harsh criticism of some of his works, claims to reflect Elizabeth's own statement, and may well have done so, since the tone and subject of Fiona's novels differed significantly from the sorts of writing that William had published up to 1894, and which he continued to release in his own name thereafter. Most of this, with some notable exceptions, consists of travel writing, like his essays on Sicily, and reviews of the latest art and literature. Assuming command as Fiona permitted complete authority and, of course, her creative expression to be fully explored. This is not the place for extensive discussion of William Sharp's motives, nor the precise nature of his deeply personal connection to Fiona McLeod. Other scholars, chiefly Michael Shaw, have begun to revise what Mark Williams has recognised as the less sophisticated vocabularies for approaching complex gender identity available to earlier criticism of William Fiona, also written prior to the meticulous editions of their combined letters, edited only recently by Professor William O'Halloran. It's the correspondence that provides most insight to the impetus and fashioning of what Elizabeth Sharp referred to as her husband's other self, Fiona, of whose existence a small group of their most intimate friends had always been aware. It reveals, above all, as does Elizabeth's tender, perceptive memoir, published in 2 volumes, fittingly, in 1910, the extent to which William's recognition of the mystery of Fiona's presence in his posthumous messages was appropriate, while also describing, with remarkable candour, the stimulus provided to his work and his life by William's chance meeting in 1891 with Edith Wingate Rinder, the niece of Elizabeth's closest friend. Edith and her husband Frank became close friends of the Sharps, and in the 14 years of their acquaintance, sometimes Edith, sometimes Elizabeth, would accompany William on almost all of his frequent trips to spas, sanatoria, or other quiet and often island locations in search of respite for his persistent ill health. In her memoir, Elizabeth acknowledges that William, quote, found the desired incentive towards a true expression of himself in the companionship and specific understanding of the friends to whom he dedicated the first of his books published under his pseudonym. This is a reference to Fore, whose title page addresses its contents to EWR. Both Edith and her husband Frank were privy to Fiona's origins and her significance, although Edith's involvement was protected by Elizabeth even after William's death, and her direct identification awaited the death of her own daughter Esther in the 1990s. Two things are worth noting at this point. Firstly, that William's affection for Elizabeth during the 1890s was undiminished by his attachment to Edith. Several of his publications after Fore in his own name were dedicated to his wife, including Vistas, which appeared in 1894 as well. It addresses Elizabeth playfully as Elspeth H. Barksia, an anagram of her name. Secondly, the complexities surrounding William and Fiona's combined existence and their intertwined lives engendered, literally, a substantial body of creative work, but were also the source of considerable exhaustion and mental strain for the decade of their duration. William observed that, as Fiona, he was enabled to write out of my heart in a way I could not do as William Sharp, but also that Fiona's regular presence caused a dazzle in the brain, whose nervous effects are referred to frequently by Elizabeth's memoir and their shared correspondence. Mitigation, usually short-term, revolved around practicalities. Throughout the 1890s, William took care to release work under his own name at the same time as new work appeared in Fiona's, and opportunities for both authors' names to appear in print together were especially welcome. In 1896, for example, William and Fiona were invited independently to comment on the subject of literature in the Highlands. Their respective contributions were printed side by side in the newspaper The Highlands News, each one composed from a slightly different standpoint, as Elizabeth observes. Despite such careful management, however, speculation on Fiona's identity recurred, sometimes forcing William to deny their connection in public. Later the same year, for example, the same newspaper published what Elizabeth describes as a sensational article, which began, "Highland Celts and Glasgow are hot on the scent of what they imagined to be a female James Macpherson." It was only partly accidental that the juxtaposition of Fiona and Macpherson, creator of the previous century's most notorious literary controversy, coincided with the appearance of the centenary edition of Macpherson's Poems of Ossian. Published in Edinburgh by the Sharp's close friend Patrick Geddes, the anthology contained William's actually excellent analysis of the Ossian phenomenon in Introduction, described by Murdo MacDonald as a significant and largely unsung precursor to the field of Ossianic criticism that began in earnest with the work of Derek Thompson in the 1950s, but also as, quote, a timely reminder that the roots of the Scottish Celtic revival of the 1890s lay well over a century earlier. It is also significant, and well documented elsewhere by Priscilla Scott, Donald William Stewart and Shane Innes, that much of the tension generated by so-called Celtic Twilight authors' increasing popularity during the 1890s stemmed from their ignorance of Gaelic, and worse still, that authors such as Fiona McLeod encouraged the contemporary decline of the Gaelic-speaking communities in which many of their most popular works were set, as long as the spirit of those communities, largely oral literature, could be preserved in English. In other words, Fiona and many contemporaries were condemned for seeking to ensure the future of Anglophone readers manufactured nostalgia at the expense of living speakers' managed decline. Part of the biography that William had constructed for Fiona stated her place of birth as a conveniently unnamed island in the southern Hebrides, and asserted her fluency in Gaelic, an effect that he hoped to enhance by sprinkling a handful of Gaelic phrases throughout Fiona's novels, usually untranslated and usually spelled wrong. In reality, the extent of William's command of the language is unclear, while the phrases themselves, as Priscilla Scott has demonstrated, were lifted straight from the pages of Mary Michela's Tourist Handbook of Gaelic and English Phrases for the Highlands, published circa 1882. As Scott has observed, this was only one of the ways in which the work of William and Fiona served to, quote, rarefy and exoticize the Gaelic-speaking people and their culture, idealising the way of life in the Hebridean Islands at a time when many islanders were experiencing severe economic hardship, in addition to language decline. Their emphasis on the nature of the Celtic psyche, it's always Celtic, never Gaelic, set the characteristics, and I quote, of the straight-thinking, rational Anglo-Saxon against those of the spiritual, emotional Celt, unquote, no comment, and it found little favour, as we've heard, among actual Gaels. Criticisms of Fiona's novels recognised their innate connection to the type of faux Celtic ideology established in the 1800s. For example, Father Alan MacDonald of Eriskay dismissed Farish and its author as just another Macpherson's Ossian, while Catherine White Grant, a Gaelic playwright, complained that the vogue for Celtic twilight mistiness threatened the dismissal of genuine Gaelic literature as similarly shadowy and indistinct. It never lacks clearness, she complained, if read in Gaelic. It's even more ironic, therefore, that William's introduction to the centenary edition of the Poems of Ossian summarises this exact opposition with seemingly genuine insight to the controversy itself and the concerns of contemporary Gaels, anent Macpherson's enduring legacy and the revival. Ironic primarily, since many such concerns had been fostered recently by Fiona's novels and by her well-publicised persona as a Gaelic-speaking island-dwelling woman. It is hard to place this opposition critically, unless one decides that William himself was also aware of the somewhat uncomfortable discrepancy that it presents, and interprets the latter as another example of William and Fiona maintaining deliberate public distance from each other. It may also be read, perhaps with equal discomfort, as a publicly visible manifestation of the mental strain that distancing provoked, that is otherwise apparent in Elizabeth's memoir and in hers and William's correspondence, of which there are few examples elsewhere. One exception observed by Murdo MacDonald may be William's uncharacteristically damning critique of the best-known illustration provided by Scottish symbolist artist John Duncan, another of Patrick Geddis's close acquaintance, for the first volume of Geddis's journal The Evergreen in 1895. The image incorporates a number of Ossianic as well as older Jacobite allusions, and it came to encapsulate what MacDonald has termed the almost heraldic synthesis of Celtic and related symbolism during the Scottish Revival. But it centres on the striking figure of the muse-like woman surrounded by the signs on which she reflects. The model for Duncan's Anima Celtica, identified by Abigail Berniot, is almost certainly Ella Carmichael, daughter of prolific collector Alexander and a leading figure of Gaelic academia in her own right. Born on the island of Lismore and a native speaker of Gaelic, MacDonald interprets William's animosity toward the illustration as motivated by his wariness of Ella and her inadvertent opposition to Fiona's self-appointed role. This is summarised neatly by Mark Williams as the threat posed by a real-life Gaelic-speaking young woman to a middle-aged man whose career depended on moonlighting as one. It is implied, therefore, on several grounds, that Fiona's constructed identity was centred on her Hebridean origin, and that the concept of islands infused the work that she produced throughout her career. In part, this reflects the generally westward-facing gaze of many other contemporary authors, artists, and revivalist enthusiasts, but it's also Fiona's nearest link to her ultimate point of origin, William Sharp. Though born in Paisley and raised in Glasgow, William's family also spent their summers in the West, and Elizabeth's memoir of her husband begins by recounting a lifelong attachment to the Scottish coasts and islands that began in childhood, including his frequent truanting from school. In William's own words, from 15 to 18, I sailed up every fjord, loch and inlet in the Western Highlands and Islands, from Arran and Colonsay to Skye and the Northern Hebrides, from the Rins of Galloway to the Ord of Sutherland. Lamentably, he seems to have neglected only Orkney and Shetland. This detailed familiarity seems to have remained a genuine source of inspiration throughout the lives of William and his emergent other self, Fiona, and their work's most genuine feature. Particular symbolism is attached to Iona, probably the actual scene of William's dearest memories of his childhood, which Fiona alleges as the fulcrum of imagination and belief. It seems to me, she observes in The Isle of Dreams, published in 1900, that in writing the spiritual history of Iona, I am writing the spiritual history of the Gael and of all the Celtic race. Again, no comment. The lovely, wonderful island was personified, like the writer, as sometimes a wistful mortal man, sometimes a woman, and Fiona's personal neo-pagan mythology invoked it finally as the future site of the resurrection of Christ, when he too would be reborn as a woman. To conclude, my original intention had been for this paper to explore at greater length the varying depiction of islands in original works composed either by William or Fiona, and those that derive from existing sources, chiefly the number of plays and prose tales based on medieval Gaelic literature or the poems of Ossian. There are several of both. I had intended to assess the hypothesis that depicting islands in the context of personified femininity and Gaelic femininity, or fake Gaelic femininity specifically, was of substantial importance only to the latter, even in cases where existing sources were already set in an island location. Given the complexities of William's and Fiona's relationship to the Hebrides, to the Gaelic language, and to the work of James Macpherson, alongside the complexities of Macpherson's own Ossianic legacy before and during the revival, this would not be unlikely, but it bears further investigation that I hope to have the chance for soon. Finally, in case of curiosity, the invisible woman of this panel's third instalment is not, for obvious reasons, Fiona McLeod, whose life and afterlife remains of much greater visibility than her creators. Nor is it Elizabeth Sharp, although the considerable number of publications that had nothing to do with her husband's multifaceted career are certainly deserving of greater recognition. It is, in fact, William's sister, Mary Beatrice Sharp, for whom this dubious accolade belongs today. For the decade of her brother's detailed charade, it was she whose labour was designedly concealed, but it was Mary's hand that copied out the tremendous number of letters that admiring fans from all over the world addressed to Fiona. These were sent to Mary at her own address in Edinburgh, then to William, replied to in his own hand, then returned to Mary, then copied out, and then finally dispatched to their unwitting recipient. So, to Mary specifically, to Elizabeth, to Fiona, my fellow panellists, and to all of yourselves, many thanks indeed for the time.
That was wonderful. Thank you very much. And it was I particularly enjoyed that commemoration of Mary Sharp at the end, and just the unfathomable amount of work she had to undertake to keep this facade up. It's astonishing, really. And yes, thank you. And that rounded off the third paper.
It's me great pleasure in welcoming to our next session our two Canadian colleagues and friends, Marlene Mulligan and Dr. Laurie Brinklow, who are going to take on this session of explaining who's your mother. So first of all, Marlene is going to give her presentation. Marlene is a student on the MA in Island Studies at the University of Prince Edward Island, a programme that INS has quite a lot of friendly shared activities with. We talk to each other's students, and we get the students on the programmes to meet each other and discuss things like island governance and such like things. So it's always really good to have our Canadian friends involved. Marlene is doing some thesis research which is focused on the climate adaptation in the lucrative Prince Edward Island lobster fishery, and I can certainly advocate the Prince Edward Island lobsters. I've enjoyed a few myself. So welcome, Marlene. As you say, I'll be running your PowerPoint, so just you let me know when you want me to change the slides. I'll just start now. So just give me the nod when you want things moved on. Well done,
sure.
Right, there we go.
There we go. Okay, thanks, Andrew, and thank you everybody who's listening. Appreciate the introduction. The only thing I'll add here before we move on is just to let everybody know that I'll be referring to Prince Edward Island as PEI, and might say that pretty quickly as I move along. So just so you're aware of what I mean when I say PEI. Next slide, Andrew. So after almost 2 decades of working in office environments, in 2018, this became my commute to work. Sunrise on a lobster fishing boat in the Northumberland Strait between Prince Edward Island and Nova Scotia. While it was all very new to me, I was not unlike a number of other wives and daughters working on lobster boats on these predominantly family-run, small-scale inshore lobster fishing enterprises. The local lobster fishery became not only my new livelihood and way of life, it became the center of my research interest, as Andrew mentioned, looking more broadly at adaptation to climate change in the fishery. But today I'll share with you what I've learned about the changing role of PEI women in this fishery. Next slide. The species we fish, called the American lobster, is located, as shown here in red, along the eastern seaboard of the United States, with the largest stocks found off the state of Maine, and then up and around the coasts and islands of Atlantic Canada, all the way up to Newfoundland and Labrador. Of all the coastlines in all of the United States and Canada, this species, found only here, has become the most lucrative of all fisheries in North America, with exponential increases in landings in the last 2 decades. The main reasons for these increases are believed to be better stock management practices, loss of predators with the collapse in the cod stocks, and warming waters. As I started working in the industry and becoming a student of it, I started noticing media coverage of women in the fishery. Next. As shown here, captaining their own fleets, and even one case of an all-female crew. In the PEI article, one female captain was quoted as saying, "The glass ceiling is not there. We have lifted it. And I hope that more women continue to lift that higher and higher all the time." Next. And here, acknowledging the dangers and challenges, but again, a feeling that we will see more and more women on the water. Next. And just this past March in Maine, not only are women fishing, we are excited about it. Next. I had the benefit of participating in a podcast interview with 2 women who fish in Maine. We talked about our experiences, and I can say that we all found that our passion for working in the natural environment and on the water outweighed the common challenges we face, like the physical demands of the work, the dangers, and being a woman in a male-dominated industry. Next. This headline in our local news in January 2019 caught my interest. The provincial PEI government was to undertake a study of the barriers women face to entering the fishing, aquaculture, and farming industries. This local study was in response to a report from McKinsey Global Institute earlier that year, which showed that narrowing the gender gap in Canada could contribute an additional $150 billion to GDP across the country over 10 years, which they suggested would translate into $600 million in PEI. They indicated this should be done by reducing gender inequality and increasing the number of women in higher productivity sectors like those of this study. So at this point, I wondered, what baseline are we working with in 2019? What do we already know about women in the fishery and PEI? Next. In terms of statistical data, gender simply isn't tracked. That means we have no records of male versus female license holders, fleet registrations, or even cork licenses for laborers. I can tell you that in 2018, there were 1,217 lobster licenses in PEI, and the women I interviewed for my thesis, who captained their own boats, could count on one hand the other women they knew who were captaining boats. They did explain to me that beyond that, there are a number of licenses in women's names, but their fleets are fished by husbands and sons. It's generally acknowledged in the global literature that there's a shortage of data on women in the fisheries, referring to theirs as an invisible contribution. In the lobster fishery, that was known as shore work, selling the catch, administrative and financial management of the family enterprise, childcare, food preparation, and if formally employed in the fishery, women would most likely be found in fish processing jobs. Why were women in our local fishery going from being invisible to finding themselves in the headlines and the subject of government studies? Next. A couple of key drivers for women moving into more visible roles in the fishery are highlighted in the gray literature. There is no academic literature that I have found on this for our region. The first big driver of change came in the 1980s when landings and prices were low and costs were climbing. The lobster fishery was not lucrative. These family fishing enterprises could no longer afford to hire helpers from outside. Many women moved into the helper positions. Some had lost their jobs in fish processing factories as the fin fisheries were also declining. Unemployment insurance programs eventually allowed a family to establish 2 or more claims for assistance to the same household. This provided cash through the winter season for fishers and allowed women's roles to begin to be financially compensated and contribute to the household income. The transition from shore to boat work was not easy. Often women had to fight in court for official recognition as fishers and for their right to draw unemployment insurance or to claim government compensation. Next, please. In more recent years, especially the last 10, the lobster industry has become very lucrative. Mothers and daughters have been working on boats since the 80s. They've been given the chance to learn the trade, acquire the skills, and develop their own passion for the work, which is thought to be the other driver moving these pioneer fisher women into the front of the boat. Next. A report titled At the Table, Exploring Women's Roles in the PEI Fishery, looked at women's roles between 1980 and 2008 and outlines 3 specific instances of women organizing themselves to advocate for better management or fairer prices in the industry. One was called Women's Fishnet, which was local participation in a national organization. Another was a group called Women in Support of Fishing, who were lobbying buyers for better prices for Irish moss, as their local industry in Western PEI was failing economically. And the third was Women for Environmental Sustainability, a group that was formed to help the fight against large corporate herring seiners fishing in spawning areas off the east point of PEI and creating great concern among the local community about depleting the stocks. The last example took place in the early 2000s, and as you can see from the images here from our local media, it was a very public matter involving many people, and it spanned a number of years. It was characterized with protests, blockades, and threats of violence. This group of women took it upon themselves to research the issues, talk with stakeholders, and attend meetings with government and fishermen's associations to try to move the concerns forward to conclusion. And while they are certainly not the single force that moved the government to eventually ban the seiners, they were found to be a positive component to the success. Next, I'd like to show you some of the images and artifacts from their efforts. I would like to, but I can't. There aren't really any to be found. Not outside of this report, which they commissioned themselves, and a few quotes in the local newspapers. In fact, the case study on the group's efforts found that after the process was complete, not only was this group of women not invited to subsequent meetings, they were not included in the stakeholder tree that was published in a review 3 years later. Invisible. Next slide. As these quotes about the group illustrate, there were definitely mixed reactions to the leadership role these women stepped into in an effort to help their families and their community. As one interviewee put it, they received positive feedback from many, and negative feedback from many. The Fishermen's Association board members showed some resentment toward the attention the women were getting and never did invite their participation in the association. And where do women find themselves in the fishery on PEI a decade later? Next slide. Women captaining their own boats is newsworthy these days because it is news. It's very novel. Even at a global scale, women's participation and leadership in this male-dominated industry remains far behind other industries. According to the United Nations Fisheries and Agriculture Organization, only 1 in 100 top seafood companies is headed by a woman. And it is their feeling that this lack of women in leadership leaves the industry ill-prepared to address the sustainability and food security challenges ahead. Next. The PEI government released the results of their study in 2020. Their survey received 286 responses and was targeted to groups associated with PEI fishing, aquaculture, and agriculture industries. 67% of the respondents indicated they had lived in a household in which at least one member was actively employed in one of the industries. Of all those respondents that chose to answer the demographic questions, 70% indicated they identified as female and 25% as male. 42% of female respondents and 24% of males believed that women had barriers to working in the fisheries. Interestingly, 55% of men didn't believe there were unique barriers for women at all in these industries, compared to 18% of women. A couple of respondents commented that they didn't see a need in this day and age for a gender study, and it was a waste of government funds. Next, please. On the left here, you can see the types of barriers the respondents felt existed. Just over 50% indicated that pregnancy, gender bias, and managing traditional female tasks such as childcare or housework were unique barriers to women participating in these industries. The remainder of items receiving responses from 30 to 50% included things like old boys clubs, double standards, and more items related to having children. On the right, we have the results for which interventions respondents believed would be most helpful. Topping this list was mentorship opportunities and funding programs. Focus groups and interviews were conducted as well to provide further detail to inform the recommendations, which are summarized on the following slide. Next. The recommendations fall under the 3 headings shown here. The most popular category for respondents was the mentorship, networking, and leadership items, including policy changes that would see women represented on decision-making bodies. This was a key feature of the 2009 At the Table report, which described in detail the barriers to women having a voice in the industry, including that only bona fide license holders, mostly men, have a vote and therefore a voice within their Fishermen's Association. A policy the association asserts is driven by federal government regulation. Under the education and resources recommendations, we see items that reflect the fact that entry into the fishery is predominantly through inheritance, as is the acquisition of skills through hours and years of working alongside fathers and grandfathers, handing down the wisdom and know-how for the livelihood. What we see here are interventions that would make it possible for anyone outside the existing participants to enter the fishery. But certainly, in addition to these types of interventions, we must acknowledge and address the cultural attitudes and beliefs that continue to influence gender inequality. Next. This quote is taken from the 2020 PEI government report. Quote, responses reflect cultural bias that impact women's ability to enter these industries to begin with, and once working, continue to cast women as outsiders. This clearly states that cultural gender bias is very alive and well in the industry. Their report and the others I've mentioned include numerous examples and quotes of the types of bias women in the fishery experience. I could list those here, I could share my own. But I'd rather remind us that, like women in every endeavor the world over, we can rise above the biases. And we can follow our passions and inclinations, even if they take us into dangerous and physically demanding situations. Next. To conclude, I think it's promising that gender in fisheries is on the PEI policy agenda, whether some people think it should be or not. I think we have a long, long way to go to even reach the levels of advancement women have seen in other industries. But it is promising that some of the structural and systemic barriers like childcare and voting rights are known and documented. It is still very much a pioneering stage for women in the PEI lobster fishery, and like all movements, change will require sheer grit and determination from those emboldened and impassioned enough among us to raise the glass ceiling. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Marlene. Very thought-provoking, and I'm looking forward to the questions that I'm sure that will generate. So we will keep the questions until after Laurie has delivered her paper, but I'm sure there will be some interesting ones. So thinking of the Shetland situation, if Shetland went down that road and there were female crews, that would be an interesting change of culture. So thank you very much indeed, and I'll pass the rights and role to Laurie now.
Great, thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here today, and thanks to all of you who made this happen, especially Andrew and Leanne doing the troubleshooting this morning. That's fantastic. Like the rest of us, I wish it were in person, but setting the clock for 4:45 to be here this morning, I felt like I was getting up early to go to the airport. So much so that sleep was hard coming last night. I was so excited. I was delighted to hear Sean Reynolds talk earlier today about women visual arts in the Northern Isles and how women are not represented equally in the National Gallery's collecting practices. There's so many resonances with my story from Prince Edward Island, and I'm delighted to talk about these today. So in 2018-2019, the Confederation, let me just see that I can advance this. Where does it go? There we go. The Confederation Center of the Arts, Art Gallery and Museum, which I'll try to refer to as the CCAGM, in Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island, featured the show Who's Your Mother? Women Artists of PEI 1964 to the present. The title took the oft-used phrase, who's your father? Asked to you by strangers when they're trying to place you in the island scheme of things, and turned it on its head. The show brought to the fore the increasingly prominent role women have played in the visual art scene for over 50 years, mirroring the struggle for equality of the sexes. As stated in the curator's statement, quote, in an era defined in great part by the rise of feminism, self-expression and empowerment go hand in hand. The exhibit was sparked when CCAGM director Pan Wendt was going through some files and came across a letter written by artist Sandy Kowalik in the mid-1990s, asking why the center's permanent collection had disproportionately more pieces by men than women, contrary to what seemed to be happening on the island as far as art production was concerned. Wendt, with co-curator Lisa Terrio, took a look at the permanent collection through a gender lens and realized the bias. In 2017, they set about visiting women artists' collections, with the end result being 19 new acquisitions to the collection and an exhibit that would address the stark gender disparity in their acquisitions to better reflect today's visual art scene. As Terrio said in her remarks, there is, quote, a long legacy of mother artists who have nurtured the arts here on PEI. Indeed, both curators argue the visual arts on PEI now produce more female than male artists. So this presentation explores how being islanded affected women's prominence in a profession that was traditionally dominated by males on what has generally been considered a conservative island. It will briefly summarize the 19th and early 20th centuries of women making art, then we'll look at some 21st century factors that influence art making and the creation of home on the island through the show Who's Your Mother and beyond. So the contribution of PEI women to the arts in its early days was first documented in a serious way in a publication called First Hand, Arts, Crafts and Culture, created by PEI women of the 20th century, produced by the PEI Interministerial Women's Secretariat and the PEI Advisory Council on the Status of Women in 2000. The project traced women's contribution to the island's cultural fabric and economy through writing, quilting bees, rug hooking parties, painting and photography, and traditional Mi'kmaq basket weaving, all of which, quote, bound together the craft tradition and simultaneously created ties of friendship and community, or neighborliness, wrote Jane Ledwell and Sasha Mullally in their introduction. They go on to say, the hooking of rags into mats stands as a metaphor for the crucial role women played in contributing to the vitality of island household economies as they wove, used, reused, and occasionally sold textiles that kept their families warm and their homes beautiful. Baskets woven by Mi'kmaq women, they note, disseminated a record of island Mi'kmaq tradition, which would help future generations resist assimilation and ensure a degree of cultural survival with every carefully woven strip of wood. The project was called First Hand because, as noted by Ledwell and Mullally, throughout the past century, women's hands carried out a variety of important tasks, from kneading bread to hoisting children, from typing memos to building houses, from playing pianos to knitting, to mat hooking, to painting, to sculpting, to basket weaving, to shooting photographs, to writing poems, to making quilts. So the project looked at writing, the fine arts and traditional arts that told the stories of women who became makers, as well as art educators and facilitators. It documented the sojourner immigration patterns of women who traveled to the world's art centers and brought back ideas from some of the most accomplished artists of the time to influence Prince Edward Island artists too, through various social means like photography clubs, informal gatherings, and galleries. Many of them became teachers and organizers and facilitators. As Ledwell and Mullally wrote, women's work in arts and culture does much more than, quote, pretty up the community. It creates the community by forming bonds among individuals and defines the community by providing outlets for individual and collective stories. The artistic works of Prince Edward Island women are the community's history because they are the concrete, readable, usable evidence of traditions that have been carried out by generations and passed on so that we remember old stories and have a variety of forms for telling new stories. So this history, or herstory, is useful to the island studies conversation as it demonstrates that islands are rarely a closed loop. Although set apart from the mainland, and Prince Edward Island was very much set apart until the 1920s when the first ferry system was created, and before then, winter crossings were by those perilous ice boats, there was a constant back and forth on the eastern seaboard and the Boston states of the US and across the Atlantic to the British Isles and Europe, trading in goods, people, and culture. So these traditions continued throughout the mid to late 20th century, which is the period covered by Who's Your Mother? Although the show included works by over 40 island women artists, I'd like to focus on the works of a few of those influential women who continued the tradition of bringing new ideas to an old island, continuing to help women find their voice within and beyond the domestic sphere. So the first is Hilda Woolnough. Born in Northampton, England in 1934, Hilda was one of the island's most influential, quote, come from away, and you'll hear me say that again, artists arriving on PEI in the 1970s. Educated at Chelsea School of Art in London and the Institute Allende in San Miguel de Allende, she recognized that PEI women were making art through traditional quilts and other crafts. These were women who viewed their own work as a kind of humble thing that they would share among family and friends. She set out to encourage women to create their own designs. Some unexpected pieces in Who's Your Mother include a quilt made in 1975 by a village craft group in Bedeck. And sorry, I couldn't get my hands on an image. Next time I will. Says CCAGM curator Pan Wendt, Hilda showed up and wanted to encourage them to think of it as a really important art form. And that was probably in hand with her feminism and her appreciation for women's work and ability to make pictures. She was always competing in an art world dominated by men, so she really saw this as an important forum. He goes on to say she encouraged them to be a little bit more daring and not stick to exactly all the traditional patterns. So she actually gave them designs that were a hybrid of her own motives and traditional patterns brought together, and they executed it. So Hilda went on to become a force in PEI's artistic community in the 80s and 90s, running the artist-run Great George Street Gallery and spearheading the creation of the Arts Guild in Charlottetown. Says Pan Went, Hilda had a very striking persona, a big personality. She was kind of the queen of the art scene on PEI. So Hilda's achievements were honored repeatedly during her lifetime, and she received the Father Adrian Arsenault Senior Arts Award, recognizing achievement as a PEI artist in 1999, and was elected to the Royal Canadian Academy in 2000. Women artists have lived with the realities of systemic inequality to such an extent that it was often preferable to conceal one's gender in order to succeed. One of the most telling pieces in Who's Your Mother was a 1964 letter addressed to Mr. Woolnough in response to one she signed as H. Woolnough when she submitted her piece, Butterfly Number 3, to the gallery for consideration. After months of correspondence with the gallery director, she only revealed that she was a woman, and she wrote, contrary to what you may believe, I am a woman and not in the least bit anthropoid, only after receiving her check. So next up is Erica Rutherford. Now, Erica was the first transgender woman I've ever met. Born Eric Rutherford in Edinburgh in 1923, he was an artist and actor until he transitioned in 1976 and became Erica. She moved to PEI in 1985, where she became one of the island's foremost printmakers and started the Printmakers Council of PEI. She became a member of the Royal Canadian Academy in 1999 and won the Father Adrian Arsenault Senior Arts Award in 2009. She published several books, including her memoir, 9 Lives, Yoga for Cats and Dance for Cats, and she illustrated Edward Lear's Owl and the Pussycat, which was one of my kids' favorite books, and also a Prince Edward Island ABC. Of the Who's Your Mother show, Erica's granddaughter, Isabella Rutherford Torlone, says, both of my grandmothers are featured in Who's Your Mother. When I say both my grandmothers are in it, I mean my mom's parents. This makes me cry. One of my mom's parents is trans, that's Erica Rutherford, and it means something extra special for her to be recognized in this exhibition. So next up are 4 other women featured in the show. This is Catherine Miller. Oh, there's Erica's last painting that I had there, her print. So next up is Catherine Miller, a fiber artist who sadly passed away in 2020. Of her piece, Making Lists, featured here, she says, lists provide a picture of our everyday life, whether I have to go pick up my son, pick up an onion on the way home, or phone my mother. Another powerful image of Catherine's comes from an earlier show called Catherine Miller Changing Environs, which explored the island's land use and environmental practices through the vocabulary of her long-standing textile practices. So Rising Sea Level PEI 2010 was a series of 5 recognizable images of PEI in paint, white wool, and rusted square iron nails, showing the island becoming several islands. It was a wake-up call for many islanders, including me, that our beloved PEI would, conceivably, in the next generation become Prince Edward Islands. Another is Brenda Whiteway. Brenda's current work explores the passage of time, particularly as it relates to rural life, past and present, and the effects of urbanization and technology on traditional ways of life. Brenda's White Sands PEI Shoreline project is a further exploration of these themes through paintings, drawings, photographs, and mixed media of a small coastal area in White Sands at the eastern end of Prince Edward Island, which has personal significance but resonates on a universal scale. To Brenda, an island at its heart is a balance of relationships, people to the land and water, history interwoven with community, family, and culture. An island can be viewed as a microcosm of the human and natural world and as a metaphor of the human experience. The idea of incorporating the image of a life ring into an artwork was a result of thinking about climate change in relationship to islands physically and metaphorically, of islands threatened and islands flourishing. Rilla Marshall is a graduate of NASCAD, which is the Nova Scotia College of Art and Design in Halifax. Through her textile show Home Terrain, translates data and aerial photographs into weaving, creating abstract landscapes that show population and land use, including asthma and cancer rates, taking hold cold, hard facts and data and translating it into art, engineering, as she says, on a small scale. Textiles for her are, quote, women's work from the domestic sphere. Now that she's a mother, she finds herself imposing her own personal narrative onto the landscapes. Being on an island, she sees its vulnerability, creating pieces to show sea level rise and climate change. In the Liminal project, she explores the changing shoreline geography of Atlantic Canada through textiles and mapping. So when the tide goes out, 2010 to 2014, it depicts an aerial view of St. Peter's Island and Rice Point. So you can see there, though, that's the aerial photo, and this is her piece of art that goes with it. The patterned area with the red chevron embroidery depicts the land bridge connecting the point to the island created by sandbars at low tide. In the following, Rilla's interpretation of a map of Charlottetown, she wove all the areas of land which will be underwater in the future as red in this town is small and close to the water, 2011 to 2015. Finally, I'd like to show you two sculptures by my good friend Sandy Kowalik, whose letter sparked the idea for the exhibit and who wrote the chapter in first hand on the visual arts, which I referenced. A pair of pears in Who's Your Mother captures what's inside shape and form, a kind of emptiness. A graduate of the Ontario College of Art, she's also the curator of the art gallery in the Dune Studio Gallery, which focuses exclusively on art by Prince Edward Island artists, carrying on the tradition of so many of her foremothers. As I noted before, Who's Your Mother was curated to rectify a gap in PEI's cultural history to document the idea that women artists were as active in the arts as men were. Perhaps they were riding the wave of feminism that was happening elsewhere on an island that is often characterized as conservative and traditional. But it is on islands that ingenuity out of necessity happens. Women take on men's roles out of necessity. We've had centuries-long connections with the Boston States and New York City, where women have gone to study and bring back art from outside as sojourners. Then the Back to the Land movement in the 1970s brought new art, new blood, transplant, and CFAs, those come from a ways again, who brought money and ideas from outside. They have been influential teachers who've been part of and who have led several important institutions. And today, it doesn't matter that we're on an island away from the perceived center. We can choose to live here and be part of a global dialogue, part of the same conversations that are happening elsewhere. As the curators of Who's Your Mother wrote, this story of change is far from over, but the collection now presents a more accurate picture of local artistic production since 1964, the mentors and pioneers, the professionals and the amateurs, and a promising new generation. It's a continuing, ongoing process of trying to right inequalities. They say our icon, Anne of Green Gables, is a sort of pre-feminist feminist, so I think it's appropriate that this is happening here. So I'd like to conclude with one of the women identified in Who's Your Mother, and that's Elaine Harrison. She was born in 1915 in Nova Scotia and graduated from Dalhousie University in 1937 with a Bachelor of Arts with distinction in Latin and English. Immediately thereafter, she moved to PEI with her parents, where she taught high school. She has been described as an inspired teacher, believing that education was not a means to an end, but a way of life, about nurturing the creative mind. She was a self-taught artist, reading and studying the works of all kinds of artists. In addition to being a painter, she was a publisher committed to bringing island women's stories into print in Western PEI. In 1997, she received an honorary degree from UPEI. In her later years, she could get quite political, which I describe in this poem I wrote for her in my book, for her and her partner, Eleanor Wheeler, after I visited them in the 1990s. So the poem's called Eleanor's Eyes. She'd have a fit if she knew I was writing about her, about the egg and ham salad sandwiches, the coconut cream pie that the cat licked in the box on the table. Have another sandwich, dear. Shut up, dog. You've already had 4. Good thing we were having sandwiches. If I'd cooked you supper, I'd have thrown it out. That's what happens when you come late. Fierce guard of privacy. She'd rather talk of ideas than herself. Poets she hears on the radio, politicians who won't pave her road, and Eleanor, who would have stopped her last Sunday from talking to those journalists, Eleanor, who lived with her for 50 years, the last 15 of them blind, Eleanor, who loved classical music and cats and her, Eleanor, who died last Christmas. Her paintings hang on crooked walls, cats with crazed eyes, Forests with trees that sway to Eleanor's music. Colors dance till she traps them with the sharp tongue of her knife. Edges not so subtle blend to sunset, and time for a walk to the headland where Eleanor went every day. Shows us where she scattered Eleanor's ashes across the point, ashes that left Michaelmas daisies in their wake, tiny purple stars that wink at the lobster boat slicing in front of the sun as it dangles. Days hold tenuous as it shivers and slips behind the line that marks the edge of the sea. The last boat silent glides home. Back inside her house, I feel like I've grown to fill my skin. Beside her, I'm 6 feet tall. Music sings in my veins. Think how we shouldn't be afraid of heights, just edges. So in honor of the many women on PEI who have committed their lives to pushing the edges, I dedicate this presentation. And here's just a few more of my favorites. Thank you very much. I'm just going to go back for a sec because I wanted to show you this. Marlene, when I told her that I was going to be talking about Elaine Harrison, told me that her mom grew up in Bedeck, near Fernwood, where Elaine lived. And so this painting of all of the children with the snowmen are some of Marlene's family. So I just wanted to point that out. And again, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Laurie. And I'm so used to talking to you in such a relaxed manner over the VC, I actually forgot to introduce you. So that, folks, was the marvellous Dr. Laurie Brinklow. Thank you very much for the wonderful images and the splendid poem as well. And Laurie is the interim coordinator of the Master of Arts in Island Studies at the University of Prince Edward Island, and she talks to my students and I talk to hers. So sorry about that, Laurie. I just thought, go launch into Laurie. I forgot. Isn't that terrible? So apologies for that. So we have some interesting questions there for both of you. So I think there's some fish-based ones and some island-based ones. But I think we'll start with Marlene. Well, let's see. We've got it's more of a comment about the canal boat industry in the UK during the mid-19th centuries. And there seems to be a parallel there with family members, particularly wives, taking over and helping out in the role in the canal boats. So it makes me think, is it dependent on the role of the family when it comes to women being involved in the fishing? Is it, yeah, do they take a role within the family-owned boats?
Happy to comment on that, Andrew. I know certainly in the small scale lobster fishery that I study and work in, women or men, it's a family thing. Even as a young male, it would be very hard to get into the industry if you didn't have a family member or somebody that would take you under their wing and teach you and kind of help you acquire the assets, especially in terms of the assets at this point. The prices to get into the industry have really skyrocketed over the last few years and are almost out of reach for most, really. Yeah.
Thank you. And a sort of follow-up question. I know you study the lobster fisheries. Is there anything happening as far as whitefish fishing? Are the women taking up roles within that as well?
Whitefish, like finfish?
Yeah, finfish, yeah. Trawling, things like that.
Yeah, I can comment a little bit on that. Like, there's not a lot of that fishing that happens here anymore, just because the stocks, like it's not it's not a viable way of life anymore. So people that do fish it tend to have what we call a bona fide license. So that means that they have a license to fish multiple species, and they would likely be fin fishing for bait, actually, for the lobster fishery, because that's where they can make their livelihood. But that being said, there are examples, and in that podcast I participated in, both those women and one in particular were working like in offshore haddock fishing, and not haddock, but halibut fishing. And those kinds of injuries. So it's not completely unheard of, but again, across the board, we're talking about a very few number of women.
Thank you. And there's a final fisheries one from Megan Corton, who's is a Canadian, and she wonders if, in terms of women's greater involvement in fishing and taking on, in inverted commas, male roles, does this translate into a greater burden for women who have to balance motherhood and captaincy, whereas men only have to, well, look after the fishing, perhaps?
Yeah, absolutely. That's the number one barrier for women. And what the work looks like in the fishery is, intense in terms of the hours and the time. Certainly here we fish in truncated seasons, so you put in a lot of days in a row with very long hours. So those women that are doing it have figured out how to do it with support, like with help with getting kids to school or after school care and that kind of thing, which did certainly show up in the government study that there will be need for supports and programs in that area. Again, one of the women I participated in the podcast with, she was a single mom, and she actually took like her toddler and small child in the boat for days at a time, that she would sleep or play or whatever in the forecastle and that kind of thing. So again, that's that grit and determination, like that the path is not there, and you have to really want to do it and figure out how to make it work.
Thank you very much. So, well, moving on to the art and islandness questions. We have a comment here from Kate, saying, as well as enjoying the papers, she points out the recent project which explored islandness by Vivian Ross Smith and Newfoundlander Jane Walker. And I know that you're aware of that, Laurie, and it just made me think, since you showed us so many aspects of island-based artwork, is it a big thing in Prince Edward Island to produce islandness or island-based art, or is it just that you picked up on certain good examples from the gallery? Or, is it 50% of the art is on islandness themes, or is it just a small core series of works?
I would think it's probably more like 80%, if you factor into the equation, the landscape, and how artists use the landscape to portray their sense of home. And of course, because Prince Edward Island, before the pandemic, was very much a tourism place. We attracted over 1 million tourists a year. A lot of artists did stuff that was particularly pleasing and purchasable for tourists, which would have included elements of what makes Prince Edward Island landscape so incredibly beautiful and special for them to take home. And there would be maybe 20% of the artists that were doing work that was more abstract or out there or just plain weird. When you have people on a very conservative island thinking, oh my God, what is that? And so often one of our main best well-known male artists named Brian Burke, actually his stuff is very abstract, and he did show before he passed away in galleries more so off island than on, but people were still very proud of him, even if they didn't quite get what he was getting at. So yeah, I would think that there are elements of PEI that show up in most pieces.
That's fascinating. Are there examples comparable to the Mitchiness pictures that John showed us at the very beginning, of sort of associated with the fishing and the dangers of the sea?
No, I have not seen any. I could be wrong, but no. And just like there on, I love Mitchiness. When I went to the Faroes, and that's when I did ask him that question earlier about the instantaneous recognition, because I felt it too when I went to the Faroes and got to go to the art gallery there and saw this amazing painting that he had done called The Funeral, or After the Funeral, and it was probably as high as the wall. It was just incredible. And then we got to go and see where Mitchiness was, the island itself. So it was pretty incredible. But even I don't think we're not seeing as many of those stark reminders of the dangers of living on Prince Edward Island. It's more the pastoral, not like in Newfoundland, for instance, where you would get that real rawness in the art. Here it's much softer, I think. There are a few people, and even winter scenes. We're not even seeing very many winter scenes on PEI, and which the Elaine Harrison painting was kind of fun to show because it was actually a winter scene, but there are very few artists that are engaging with those other sides of PEI. I could be shot down, when I leave out of here, you leave here and people say, oh yeah, well, think about this and think about this person, but most of them are mostly just the landscape with a few pieces that are about mortality in general and things like that, but not as powerful reminders of the sea around us that the Mitchiness paintings evoke.
Thank you. And well, we've just got time for plenty of questions, but we won't belabor the fact, because I know you want a cup of coffee. But just before we go, there's a question about the Indigenous people, the First Nations people. And well, first, the question is, does First Hands also recall the referencing of Indigenous peoples as First Nation? But more generally, are they represented in the gallery as well?
Yes, they are, and they have had exhibits that are specifically devoted to some of their work, and it's been more so in recent years, of course, as we become more aware. Of course, First Nations people have been here way longer, about 13,000 years before we came along, the settlers, and so it's very important to acknowledge those contributions that they have made to our community and to the island in general. And so it is showing, you can go to Lennox Island, which is one of the reserves where they have the most amazing craft shop and art gallery with their stuff there, which shows in Charlottetown and in other places around the island. I did pop the first-hand PDF into the link to it in the chat, so I hope people will take a look at it. It's really amazing what they did, the women that created all of these modules.
Thank you very much. And I think we'll wrap it up there. Another two fabulous presentations. Thank you very much. Just an excellent end to this part of the afternoon. So thank you very much. And there we go.
Thank you. Thanks, Marlene. Thanks, Andrew. Thanks, everybody who came before us.
So I think we can, we can say it is going well at